Well, starting this video at the Gloucester Jet Age Museum, looking at a Gloucester Gamecock, which was a fighter biplane from the 1920s. This isn't actually the original plane. It was rebuilt in the 90s from photographic records and things like that. And actually, the story behind this is absolutely incredible and well worth a visit to the museum to see and hear all about. But what's of course apparent from this is this enormous mahogany propeller, wooden propeller there, with the brass leading edges, and they often would put brass or aluminium at the edges of the propeller blades to give them more resilience. Of course, the story of propellers started well before heavier than air flight, but actually they started off moving water. Archimedes' screw, of course, 200 BC, and before it with the Egyptians. I think they also had an idea. There you are, there's my lovely propeller that's also hanging on the wall as a clock. But it's a nice small wooden propeller, fixed pitch, of course, and here's a lovely phosphor bronze, boat propeller. And you can see they're broadly the same principle, aren't they? Of course, the boat one, of course, moves the water and provides the thrust, and the air screw moves the air and provides the thrust. Slightly different characteristics. If you look carefully at this beautiful air screw, you can see, first of all, it's laminated construction, and that's to give it more strength. And it also allowed the master craftsmen that make these to really check each part of the wood, each plank of the wood can be really closely examined. If you think about it, if you made it from a solid lump of wood, you might have defects that you couldn't see, whereas generally by smaller, thinner planks, you can reduce the chance of hidden defects considerably. And when you put these together, it does provide an immensely strong construction. This propeller blade is actually quite light, and yet it's really rigid as well, and I think that's laminated construction does allow that. The first successful propeller used on a heavier than air aircraft was by the Wright brothers in 1903 with their Wright Flyer, which they successfully, of course, flew at Kitty Hawk in America. And their propeller, there was a very large propeller, and it was at the back of the plane, so it was sort of pushed the plane along instead of pulled it along as they do in modern propellers. But Orville Wright generated a propeller that was sort of manufactured in a bike shop. They got it pretty much right. The concept of having a sort of wing, effectively, if you look at the cross section of this, it has that sort of wing-like quality that they considered, instead of uplift, of course, that would provide the thrust that they needed. And their propeller was, I think, only about 10% less efficient than the modern state-of-the-art equivalent. And it wasn't just luck. They used scientific methodology. They used wind tunnel tests. Although they didn't test the final propellers, they hoped for the best, and they worked a treat. They provided a lot more, sort of thrust than they actually needed, I think. So, a great success. And one of the original propellers still is kept at the Smithsonian Museum in America. They were enormous great propellers. We owe a lot to them, for obvious reasons, not just for the first successful flight, but actually for their incredible considerations for the use of scientific methodologies to generate the propellers. When they asked the US Navy for how they designed ships' propellers, they said it was sort of like trial and error. There wasn't sort of advanced mathematics for it in those days. I'm sure there is now. I'm sure it's incredibly state-of-the-art supercomputers are used to make sure they're the most efficient design and everything else. But in the turn of the last century, that wasn't the case. But you can see, look at the beautiful laminate construction. Now, interestingly, when these are cut out, they're originally they're certainly broadly cut out via machines. But master craftsmen then work these blades with sanders and the eye and the hand to generate the final shape and to balance them. It's really important that they're balanced. Indeed, so finely balanced are they that on a good bearing, even the weight of a paperclip on one tip would cause the propeller blade to rotate. So beautifully balanced, expertly crafted. Although wooden propellers have another great property, which is they generally are more damping. They don't suffer as much with issues with harmonics and things like that. They're quite good for absorbing a vibration. Can last a long time. There are sort of sayings that you used to have to change these as often as tyres, and that's why a lot of them end up as memorabilia. But it's not the case. Some wooden propellers last years and years and years, and one or two still going strong from the 1940s. Also, you may be surprised to learn that a lot of Spitfires actually had wooden propellers. They were a type of wooden construction that had a sort of like a polymer laminate that went over the top of it that was sort of autoclave to make them very, very strong. Very clever way of doing it. But they were wooden construction, and it saved a lot of materials that would have otherwise been very scarce back in World War Two. But still provided very strong propeller blades. The very later ones were, of course, dual pitch or changeable pitch metal ones, but a lot of Spitfires were, this type of wooden blade construction. And there's a company in Germany that can now make those same blades in the modern era to replace them. Isn't that incredible? Tips of propellers are usually yellow. These are painted red because I had some red paint, but it's really to make sure that you can see the propeller as it rotates. The yellow tips, and traditionally a black propeller, is really easy to see it. No one wants to walk into one of these things rotating around at sort of 800 or 900 RPM, that's for sure. It's incredible to think, even now, about 10% of all propellers in use are wooden. They've turned out to be really good. I mean, okay, they're fixed pitch, so it's like having a bicycle where you've only got one gear, so you've got to get that compromise right. The gear's got to be suitable for higher speed, but also takeoff and climbing, and that's one of the big disadvantages of the fixed pitch. Also, they have to have quite a large hub area, because that has an enormous amount of energy put into it from the engine. So that hub has to be quite thick, and wood's not as strong as metal, so the hub has to be thicker to allow for that sort of the basic physics really of the material and the power going through it. So there are some disadvantages, but 10% of all propellers are still wooden apparently, which I thought was really quite a wonderful statistic. Another advantage of wooden propellers is if in the unfortunate situation where they do crash into something, they impart less energy back into the engine and airframe because they tend to splinter and disintegrate. Whereas, of course, modern aluminium alloy propeller blades are incredibly strong. And looking at the ones I have from World War II that were sadly off crashed planes, they are in one piece. They're bent and they're contorted, but they are in one piece. So that energy would have been transferred into that propeller blade and sadly into what was left of the engine and airframe on that impact. Whereas wooden propellers, in some ways, in that respect, are a little bit safer. But as the engine horsepower has got greater and greater, when you think about the sort of centrifugal forces being some 20 tons or more on the more powerful propellers, the use of alloy materials and dual pitch or constant speed propellers was the way to go. But this isn't just an old, nostalgic era. Wooden propellers are still with us and still doing great, but they're also incredibly beautiful, and I think that's what I wanted to sort of show off this one. It didn't cost me much. All right, it's got a bit of a tacky clock on it, but isn't that beautiful? Look at that. I think it was all of about £40 on eBay, and it's one of the things that I really do think every house should have one, really, particularly if you're into your aeronautics. I mean, look at that beautiful construction. Isn't that marvellous? Anyway, a very happy new year, and I hope you've enjoyed this video, and we can all say thanks to the marvellous Wright brothers